So there's kind of two things I want to address here regarding two videos. One is from CNN, and it is a transcript from Russian troops in Ukraine, basically heard to be complaining about the North Korean arrivals. And in one case, they call them Chinese, whether that's from ignorance, as in, it's like a racist thing because they're East Asians, so, or they're just all Chinese, or whether something murkier going on, they actually think they are Chinese. Um, Either way, it's telling. It's telling that Putin is desperate. I mean, I would not go so far to say as Russia's beaten. That would clearly be wrong. It would be naive. Russia's a huge country, but unquestionably, under Putin, in recent years, it's become weaker. It's been more polarized on the world stage. It has it has few true friends left, and the friends that it does have, I mean, look at China, for example. Russia is very much a junior partner. Sooner or later, the countries that are supporting Russia will be asking for, the receipt. Basically, history shows that you cannot have two major powers like Russia and China working closely together without one side or the other having a vested interest that isn't about genuine friendship. Um, I think Xi Jinping and Putin do have common cause. They both see the West as an adversary, and they feel that they are better joining forces. That makes sense. But I think behind the scenes, Xi Jinping definitely sees Putin as a junior partner. China also cannot be seen to be openly supporting the war in Ukraine because they know they contradict themselves, given that they talk so much about the sovereignty of nation states. And China, for all its brutal human rights abuses, it hasn't actually invaded another country since Vietnam in 1978. I'm referring to the Sino-Vietnamese War. So Chinese foreign policy, whilst also aggressive, is aggressive in a different way. It's more about wolf warrior diplomacy, whereas Russia is actual military aggression. I think both are a threat to the West. I think we need to take both seriously. But does a superpower really rely on troops from a country like North Korea, the Hermit Kingdom, extremely poor? Um, I think the world's most polarized country. It just shows Putin's desperation. And these men will be used as cannon fodder, or to give a more contemporary analogy, machine gun fodder, drone fodder. Um, I actually take no smug pleasure for the map. Some people would be like, um, but honestly, I think North Korean soldiers are probably slaves. They've probably got no voice in the matter. This is what people need to understand. It's the same with Russia, really. Um, I mean, being a Russian soldier is probably one of the worst jobs in the world. It's absolutely Russia's wars in Chechnya and more recently in Ukraine shows that how disposable Russian soldiers are. Even if the Ukrainian figures are exaggerated of an estimated 1,000 Russian casualties a day, which is a staggering figure, that really is like World War One figures. Um, Even if that's an exaggeration, it's clear that Russia's paid a very high price, and this year they've been humiliated with the Ukrainian incursion into Russia, into the Kursk region. Um, so that's one thing. There's clearly cracks within the Russian military system. I don't think there is the same extent of the problem on the Ukrainian side. Now, I'm not going to say it's perfect. Zelensky has had tensions with some of his generals, and there has been problems with desertions and so on. But ultimately, the Ukrainians are going to have higher morale because it's a defensive war. Russian soldiers, they've no moral ground to stand on because when they're taken prisoner, when they start to see the truth, they'll realize they were lied to. They'll realize the Ukrainians are not Nazis, and unlike some of their colleagues, the Ukrainians don't torture POWs. Um, so there's fundamentally a different set of values there. The other part of this I want to address is Steve Rosenberg, the BBC's Moscow correspondent, surely one of the bravest men in journalism today. He asked a question to Putin at the BRICS summit in Kazan, the city of Kazan. Um, well, the question was several folds. Dmitry Peskov pitched it to Steve Rosenberg, kind of smugly put, "We don't see much of you these days." Um, Putin got very rattled, but Rosenberg asked a question in fluent Russian. He asked a question basically about contradicting Putin's own values supposedly laid out in BRICS and about the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, he was careful to call it a special military operation because you go to jail in Russia if you call it a war. Um, he's probably thin ice as it is, being the BBC correspondent. But he asked Putin this. Putin got typically arrogant and started whining about, the usual propaganda of NATO lies and NATO threatening Russia, etc. Rosenberg had put it to him that there were no drone attacks in Russia. There was no Ukrainian attack on Russia before 2022. Um, and like I say, Putin's response was typically arrogant and evasive and just playing the victim. What Putin didn't say was the reason NATO has expanded, the reason countries have joined NATO, most recently, of course, Finland and Sweden, is precisely because of Russian aggression. I mean, what Russia does not get, what the Putin regime does not get, is if you threaten people around you, sooner or later they're going to want to get away from you, and they're going to want to join the other club. Russia has done nothing to persuade neighbouring countries to be in the Russophone, right? He's done nothing to persuade these countries that they should stay away from NATO. He's done the exact opposite by constant threats. But Russian state mouthpieces, they have presenters literally threatening nuclear war casually. Of course, countries are going to gravitate towards NATO. Russia's aggression has meant that even Switzerland is starting to think about its neutrality. Now, I'm not saying Switzerland's about to join NATO, but it's forcing Switzerland to even think about its neutrality. Such is Russian tentacles in terms of subversion of other countries. Now, I mentioned that Putin has weakened Russia, and I believe that, but that doesn't mean it's, they say a cornered dog is a dangerous dog. I think that's the case with Putin. I do think he is. Um, I do think he's in his final years. I won't say final months or certainly not final weeks. I do think he's in his final years because he is getting increasingly more erratic. Putin was always a dictator, but there were points where he was a lot calmer and a lot more cool. Recently, I've noticed even in Russian press conferences, he seems to be more rattled, more, you know, that's obvious. The unfortunate thing about this is Steve Rosenberg is a world class journalist. I have absolute respect for him. When I defended the BBC recently, as people like him I have in mind, that is not an easy job being the BBC's main correspondent in Moscow. It's a real fine balancing act. And I remember he was asking questions to Margarita Simonian, the shameless mouthpiece of RT, and she was just regurgitating Putin's lines about NATO aggression and all this sort of thing, because Margarita Simonian is not a journalist, she's a nationalist mouthpiece. Um, I think she's the Joseph Goebbels of Putin's regime, actually, but well, a toss up between her and Dmitry Peskov. But the sad thing about this is Russian propaganda gravitates around the world. So, you'll get clips of this in China or sub Saharan Africa or parts of Asia, which will kind of be making Putin look like he's given a smart answer about NATO. Um, when he absolutely didn't. He absolutely evaded the facts of the situation, the fact that Russia has been aggressive, also the fact that NATO has tried to accommodate Russia, or more specifically, the West has tried to accommodate Russia. Putin didn't mention the fact that Russia was part of the G8, now the G7. If the West was trying to make things hard for Russia, why did they accommodate Russia? Why did they treat Russia as an equal partner in the G8? The fact of the matter is, even without NATO expansion, Putin has an irredentist obsession. He doesn't recognize Ukraine as a sovereign nation. And all those countries that, want to be neutral on this and they want to look at Russia as, they might criticize NATO because they have an anti West worldview. I would say to them, you consider your country sovereign. Why don't you respect the Ukrainian sovereignty? You know, so Indians, Kenyans, Vietnamese, don't you respect Ukrainian sovereignty? And if the answer is yes, it then follows that you have to condemn Putin's invasion of Ukraine. You can't be neutral on this. Neutrality is just a non-position because this isn't a case that both sides are equally to blame. It's not like Ukraine invaded Russia first or attacked Russia first. That's a lie. Um, so I'm disgusted by the knowledge that Russian propaganda out there will be distorting what Steve Rosenberg asked. Um, but he's a world-class journalist, and I think if anything happened to him, I think we should expel the Russian ambassador. Recently the Russian ambassador was asked about Dawn Sturgis, a woman who died as a result of the Salisbury poisoning, and he actually appeared to laugh at it. And he said, "Oh, well, if someone died, that's unfortunate," but he kind of laughed off the incident. It's disgusting. Um, so yeah, I think that the war in Ukraine clearly isn't going to end anytime soon. And there is going to be some Western war fatigue. I don't think we should give up supporting Ukraine though, because if we do, that will be an invitation for Putin to go even further. One reason I'm so anti-Trump is because I think Trump's version of peace in Ukraine would be pressuring the Ukrainians to basically give up their country, or a very big chunk of it. That is a disgrace. Um, Trump has proven that he's soft on Putin. Trump has proven that instead of supporting the Ukrainian people, on the very day that country was invaded, he says it's a genius move by Putin. It's disgusting. Trump is utterly unqualified for the White House. His 4 years in office were some of the worst ever, in my opinion, in terms of the positions he took and his record. Certainly his record on Russia. He talks about the world getting into chaos on Biden's watch, but if he gets back into the White House, the things he's threatened towards NATO, America pulling away from NATO. I know Mark Rutte and senior military commanders have tried to downplay this. I suspect they're doing that for diplomatic reasons. But Trump is an unstable character. We don't know what he'll do. Do I think he'll pull out of NATO in the first month? No, probably not. He might not even pull out of it in his term if he gets elected. But the very fact he's publicly condemning NATO is itself a problem. That is like a Christmas present to Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran, and it is an absolute disgrace for former American president to be so publicly attacking America's allies like that. It's a disgrace. It shows why Trump's unqualified for the White House. But anyway, I digress. Um, I do think Putin's desperate, but this war isn't going to end anytime soon. Unfortunately, the price in human life is enormous, and that is on Putin's hands. He started this war. He has initiated aggression against a sovereign nation. NATO has expanded because of Russian aggression. Those are the facts. And I'm doing a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit by putting it out there. I'll put a link to both things, the CNN transcript of these Russian troops talking about the North Koreans, and also the the segment of Steve Rosenberg questioning Putin BRICS. I'll say one thing about the BRICS. This might be for another video, but I'll say it very briefly. I don't actually think they're a major threat to the West in terms of an alliance because taken at face value, they're very powerful. You have um, several major countries there: Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa. But within them, there isn't that much unity. I mean, China and India have plenty of reasons for dispute. As recently as 2020, there was bloodshed between the two. So I really don't think West has too much to worry about regarding BRICS. Um, I think with countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, we should have dialogue and have good working relations. China and Russia, we should treat them the way they treat us. I don't think we should pander to them. Have as much communication as is necessary, but that is it. I definitely favour a more hard-line approach with China, with Russia, but we already take that. Um, but I don't think the BRICS are a serious threat, to be quite honest. And there's another thing to consider. As depressing as the situation in Ukraine is, NATO is the most powerful military alliance in history. Russia is far, far weaker than NATO. That's a reality. Yes, Russia's a nuclear power. Yes, it has a dictator who has an iron grip on power. But he's a desperate dictator. The Russian economy is weakened. Russia's position in the world has weakened. Um, I'm not saying it's weak, but it has weakened. It has, certainly compared to China. So if you take NATO and Russia side by side, NATO absolutely is more powerful than Russia. So, that's a good thing. That's why it's so concerning if Trump actually goes through with his threats. That's why this man, I hope to God he does not get into the White House. Harris can be trusted with NATO, Trump cannot. That's the reality.